Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, June 28th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Maine and the 2026 United States Senate election that is surrounding Senator Susan Collins, a multi-term Republican incumbent who has announced that she is running for re-election in the 2026 race, a very competitive one, expected to be largely because Susan Collins, a Republican, has been representing the state of Maine, which has not voted for a Republican nominee for president since 1988. Maine has been a state that has been consistently out of reach for the National Republican Party, but when it comes down to the Senate races, the Republicans have been able to do well in one of the races, largely because of Susan Collins and her popularity across this state. Now, thinking ahead, thinking about where we are in this state, the 2026 race is shaping up to be one that is largely defined not just by Susan Collins' popularity or lack thereof, but also by the lack of Democrats that have announced that are even interested in running in this Senate election in 2026. Now, Maine has a number of races going up in 2026. Both of their House races are up, and the governor's election is one that is going to be quite important. But in the governor's race, it seems as if many of these Democrats that otherwise might be poised to run for Senate simply do not want to challenge Susan Collins. I made a video on this about 2 weeks ago talking about how Democrats are in a really bad point when it comes down to finding a candidate that is right for Maine because they simply cannot at this point. But taking a look at the list of people running for governor, you might think, just take any of these candidates and run them in 2026 for Senate. At least they would be in a position where they might be able to win. You have the Maine Secretary of State, the former president of the Maine Senate. You have Angus King III, who, yes, is the son of the incumbent other United States Senator, Angus King. Hannah Pingree, who, yes, if you recognize the name, Shelley Pingree is the other U.S. representative from the state of Maine, and her daughter is now deciding that she wants to run for governor and not Senate. So many different people who are, in this position where they could be running for senator are deciding to run for governor. Why? Because they're afraid of Susan Collins. But the 2026 race, again, is one that I think is the right opportunity and the right moment that Susan Collins can finally be taken down by national Democrats. In 2020, they came up short. Sarah Gideon, at the time Speaker of the House of Representatives in the state of Maine, ran against Susan Collins and lost by roughly 8 percentage points. However, when you take a look at the ranked choice voting, the third place candidate, the Green Party essentially candidate there, the more left-wing one, had also told her voters to rank Sarah Gideon second, and she received about 5% of the vote. Had all the tabulation been conducted, chances are Susan Collins would have won by roughly 4 to 5 points, maybe even less. But the point is that she won in 2020 what at face value seemed like an 8-point margin. What's less impressive, when you look at it, which is less impressive, especially compared to 2014 when she won by a margin of 35 points. And so it's a 35-point victory reduced down to 8 points, but 2026 seems to be the year at which Democrats can finally lock into this race. Why might that be? Well, Susan Collins holds a record low approval rating for this state. Now, back in 2020, I remember covering that race because Susan Collins was not in a good position when it came down to how voters viewed her. It was 2020, and it was a race that Democrats, looked at and said, we can win this race. If Joe Biden wins Maine by 9, 10, 11 points, maybe even more, maybe we can outpace Susan Collins enough so and actually win. And Sarah Gideon, the Democratic nominee for Senate, did not lose in a single poll through the whole election cycle, was never down, never projected to lose. Everyone had this expectation that she was going to win. And so there was all this hyped up, built out idea that Susan Collins was going to be doomed. After all, her approval rating in the state was not good at all. You can see that when they asked voters, first of all, who are you voting for? Sarah Gideon at 46 to Susan Collins 42. So a 4-point race, better, right, than the 11-point race that was predicted by the poll in Maine. But the point was that just 36% of voters in the state of Maine had a positive approval of Susan Collins. These voters out there who had known much about her and had voted for her many times had said this time around she holds an approval rating of roughly 1/3 of the state. Fast forward to where she was in 2025. Today, in the most recent poll from the University of New Hampshire, her approval rating goes down quite tremendously. You can take a look that in 2026, when it comes down to Susan Collins, voters aren't super excited by her. The reason is she's not in the position where she has been very well liked for her votes. Coming off of Dobbs, coming off of Kavanaugh, coming off of all of these decisions that sure mattered in 2020. but never to the degree that she has been deemed, in many people's eyes, responsible for a lot of the decisions that come from the United States Supreme Court. And what you find is that possible, and I think this is wrong, 2024 U.S. Senate candidate favorability. I think they meant to say 2026. Sometimes they need to, proofread some of these polls here. But again, 2026 Senate candidates, Janet Mills has been floated as a hypothetical, not guaranteed, but might happen. Susan Collins holds an approval rating of just 14%. Yes, you heard that correctly. 14% for Susan Collins and an 8% approval rating amongst independent voters who far more often are willing to see it closer to the center than anything else. Voters who go back and forth between Trump, Biden, Harris, whoever it might be, many of them have an unfavorable view of Susan Collins. 60% of independents, more than the overall number, which is already in a bad place because of how many Democrats dislike her. But 60% of independents have an unfavorable view of Susan Collins. Now, when it comes down to Janet Mills, about a flip when it comes down to party ID, but still, more Democrats in Maine than independents and then Republicans, and you'll see that the favorability rating for Janet Mills is 51%, a lot better than where Susan Collins is in. So 14%, that is catastrophic. Public Policy Poll also shows that their most recent data in March also finds her with an approval rating of 24% and 61% of voters disapproving. It is insane to think about the fact that there are so many voters here, especially Republicans, who largely don't see Susan Collins as representing them across the state. Yes, they will vote for her, but they don't like her. And that approval rating and the lack of enthusiasm surrounding her does not seem like this is conducive to a candidate that in 2026 can overcome the increased partisanship of Maine and many other states across the nation, as many of those Republicans and Democrats have started to realize that these Senate races, as much as in the past, you were able to win as a Republican in a solid Democratic state if you were liked. Same thing on the Democratic side in a solid, red state if voters liked you. All of these things were known truths that no longer stand to be true today. And I do believe that at its core, Maine will not vote for Susan Collins if given a viable option on the Democratic side. But Susan Collins, for most purposes right now, has been saved by the lack of a strong Democratic opponent. When you take a look at those who have publicly expressed interest, you do have the Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives, but also that same Speaker position did not land Sarah Gideon, the Senate office in 2020. And the two candidates who have announced so far, one from the Maryland Department of the Environment, my home state, and in 2000, and also the chief of staff to U.S. Representative Katie Porter. Yes, Katie Porter from the state of California. And those who have declined, Jared Golden, who consistently outperforms in Maine's 2nd District. Trump has won it 3 times. He has won it every single time he has run for that office. And Shelley Pingree, who represents a safe blue district but doesn't seem to want to make the jump over to run for U.S. Senate. So the only real options that seem to be priority for Democrats is Janet Mills, who is the incumbent governor. But the problem is that Janet Mills is 78 years old, or would be 78 years old in time for the election. The same age that Donald Trump is right now, and that Joe Biden was when he was inaugurated into office back in 2021. Which means that in a 6-year term, you probably would only have Janet Mills running for 1, at most 2 terms, which means it would be a very short-lived time in the United States Senate, and it might not even be worth it for Janet Mills. Many Democrats are hoping that instead of just staying back and out of politics, that she decides to run for Senate, but there's no guarantee that she does, because it seems as if everybody wants to run for governor, and the only option they have for Senate is the incumbent governor, who is older than Susan Collins, who could very likely only serve 1 term. But Susan Collins, in many ways, is an electoral beast that can be taken down this time. An approval rating of 14% is nothing short of an accomplishment, but not a good one. It's something that shows that so many voters are disaffected with the job that Susan Collins is doing, Republicans, Democrats, independents alike, which is the recipe for how Democrats can beat somebody like this. Because it has taken time for her favorability rating to go down. 10 years ago, Susan Collins had one of the highest approval ratings in the United States Senate. I kid you not, you can find the data. Her approval rating rivaled that of, in some polls, people like Bernie Sanders, who had, in cases, 70, 75% approval across their state. Voters adored Susan Collins. That's why in 2014, she won by 35 points. The same reason that after the Kavanaugh vote and after Democrats soured on her and independents too, that her margin went from 35 to 8 in 2020. That's why you saw a 23, or not 23, I can't do math, a 27-point reduction in her margin in just 6 years. Now, 2026 is shaping up to be a very good year for the Democratic Party, a year at which Democrats are likely going to flip back control of the House of Representatives, and the United States Senate stands to be something that they simply cannot crack into. But they can crack into a state like Maine. And with numbers like these, it should be much better for Democrats. But it's not. It's not right now because they don't have the candidates to do it. But they should. And so Susan Collins right now at a 14% approval rating is in a really bad place. A really bad place. A very worrisome place. If I was looking at it from her political consultant perspective, I honestly might even consider advising not running for re-election because Susan Collins, if faced against the right Democrat, will lose. The question is, will the right Democrat even be on the potential primary ballot? Because everybody seems to be scared. But as more and more numbers come out like this, they don't have as much of a reason to be scared. They have all the more reason to feel invigorated and excited to run for Senate rather than run away from it. But we don't know. It might not happen. Susan Collins might be elected to another 6-year term, and maybe she'll run for re-election even far after that. Because at that point, she'd be the same age as Janet Mills, who would be running for the term right now, and yet continue to be a thorn in the side for Democratic presidents, Democratic senators, Democrats at large, and many of the voters in her state who feel disaffected, but if not given a viable opponent, will not vote her out of office. So keep your eye out on Maine. See who decides to run, see what happens, because right now it truly is a toss-up. But Democrats are losing this battle. Susan Collins is winning it, and even with record low approval ratings coming in at the lowest ranked United States senator across the country out of 100, they still cannot find somebody who is willing to take her head on and willing to beat her in November of 2026. And while it may take a while to convince somebody like Janet Mills to run, somebody does on the Democratic side. Because this is a missed opportunity, and if they do not win the Senate election in Maine in 2026, they can kiss the Senate majority goodbye this entire decade. They will not get it back unless they win Maine. So there's a lot that's on the line, actually. It's not just one race, and it's not an inconsequential one. And Democrats would be very wise to start fielding, start running, start pushing their prime and best to run in the Senate race, because the story is being written. And right now, Susan Collins is the author. And they need to take the pen from her. Not just the pen for the book, this hypothetical, right? Not just this, but in the United States Senate, they literally need to win this office if they want any chance of winning back Senate control. There's a lot of urgency. It just doesn't seem like Democrats are feeling it in the state of Maine, but time will tell as to who enters into the race and who ends up winning it come next November. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2025 6 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.